She was sold as part of a sordid debt her own father had hidden. Upon arriving at the manor, she found 7 rules and a gaze that burned in silence. What he did to her that night changed both of their destinies forever. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the very end. You won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Now, let's continue. Helen didn't know she was being traded. She believed until the very last moment that her departure for New York City would be the start of a job as an executive secretary or a project assistant, something respectable, something that would justify her father's silence and the pain in her younger sister Tanya's eyes as she closed her suitcase. Raised among the simple houses of a community deep in Appalachia, where faith was imposed like discipline, and a woman's purity was prized like currency, Helen had learned from a young age that a body could be a bargaining chip, and that her integrity was the family's last intact asset. Still, nothing could have prepared her for what she would find upon passing through the gates of the Montgomery estate, a historic mansion isolated in the hills of the Hudson Valley, where every restored wall whispered ancient stories of love, madness, and imprisonment. The bus cut through the highway with a slowness that seemed deliberate, as if to give Helen more time to rethink her choices. But what choices? The truth was there had never been a choice. Life in the small town of Hollow Ridge was a cycle of unending scarcity. Her mother's work as a cleaner barely covered the medical expenses of her father, who had lost his mobility after a farming accident. Tanya, at 17, had already received proposals from older men in town, proposals that came wrapped in words like protection and future, but which hid intentions Helen knew all too well. "You're going to have a better life, honey," her mother said at the farewell, her eyes lowered, avoiding Helen's. "Mr. Thompson said it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, her job in a mansion with important people." Of course it was Mr. Thompson, the owner of the only employment agency in the region, a broker of dreams and desperation. She should have been suspicious when he insisted she wouldn't need a resume, just full-body photos and information about her domestic skills. The employer likes simple girls raised in the country, girls who still respect traditional values. The rain began to fall as the bus entered the New York metropolitan area. Helen pressed her forehead against the fogged-up glass, trying to absorb the grey immensity that spread out before her. 23 years of life, and she had never left Appalachia. Now here she was alone with a suitcase of simple clothes, $300 saved from months of work at the local bakery, and an address written on a piece of paper already crumpled from being reread so many times. It was Richard who waited for her at the bus terminal, a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit and a permanently suspicious expression. He didn't introduce himself as a driver, security, or assistant, only as the one responsible for your arrival. On the way to the mansion, he said only what was essential. Do not ask questions about the family. Do not touch objects without permission. Do not enter closed rooms. Mr. Montgomery values discretion above all else. The rain had turned into a downpour by the time the luxury car passed through the wrought iron gates of the Montgomery estate. Through the wet glass, Helen glimpsed a structure that seemed to exist in another era, a mix of colonial revival architecture with Gilded Age influences, surrounded by meticulously designed gardens and a dense forest that isolated the property from the rest of the world. "We're here," Richard announced, parking under a stone and glass awning. "Mrs. Carmen is waiting for you at the entrance. She will explain your duties." Mrs. Carmen was a woman in her 60s, her spine as straight as a post, her grey hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull at the skin of her face. The housekeeper of the mansion for decades, she walked through the corridors as if floating, her steps silent, despite the antique wooden floor that creaked under Helen's feet. "Your clothes are not suitable," was the first sentence she directed at the newcomer after a quick visual scan. "In your room you will find a uniform. Put it on immediately." The room assigned to Helen was in the east wing of the mansion on the second floor. It was larger than the entire living room of her house back in Appalachia, with a king-sized bed covered in white Egyptian cotton sheets, a hand-carved dark wood wardrobe, and a tall window overlooking the back gardens. On the bed, as announced, was a uniform, but not the kind Helen had expected. It wasn't the traditional black dress with a white apron of a maid. It was a simple dress, a pale, almost transparent blue, too delicate to be considered work attire. Next to the dress was a sealed envelope. Inside, a 3-page contract and a list titled, Regulations of the Montgomery Estate. Helen felt her stomach sink as she read, 1. Do not enter the music room without express authorization. Do not touch the books in the main library. Do not look directly at Mr. Montgomery without permission. Tutida. Not ask questions about the family's past. 5. Do not mention the name Andrew under any circumstances. Every night, leave a fresh orchid on the staircase that leads to the conservatory. Every transgression will be noted. Every obedience will be rewarded. There was no job description. There was no mention of a salary, only compensation as agreed with the intermediary. There was no end date for the contract, just a minimum period of 3 months. And at the bottom of the page, the line where her father had signed, ceding temporary responsibility over Helen. She was rereading the document for the 3rd time when she heard 3 sharp knocks on the door. 5 minutes to present yourself in the main hall, announced Mrs. Carman's voice from the other side. Mr. Montgomery wishes to meet you. With trembling hands, Helen put on the blue dress. It was more fitted than it looked, molding to her body like a second skin. The hem reached her knees, but the nearly transparent fabric created a permanent sense of exposure. There was no mirror in the room for her to assess herself, only the growing certainty that she was there to be much more than a simple employee. The main hall of the Montgomery estate was an ode to power and tradition. Imported marble floors, works by American masters on the walls, Hopper, O'Keeffe, Wyeth furniture that blended contemporary pieces with antiques preserved through generations. And at the center of it all, sitting in a dark leather armchair like a king on his throne, was Arthur Montgomery. He was not as Helen had imagined him. Not an elderly man, paunchy and with a lecherous gaze. Arthur Montgomery was around 35, his black hair beginning to show gray strands at the temples, his body lean and strong, like someone who engages in sports regularly. His face had striking, almost sculpted features, a defined jawline, dark piercing eyes and thick eyebrows that met when he frowned, as he was doing at that moment while observing her from head to toe. Approach, he ordered, with a voice that was not loud, but carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Helen took 3 steps forward. Stopping at a distance, she considered respectful. She kept her eyes down, remembering rule number 3. Thompson said, "You have a talent for music." It wasn't a question, but Helen felt she should confirm it. "I studied piano for a few years, sir. At my town's church." "Look at me when I speak to you." Helen raised her eyes, surprised by the command that contradicted the rules she had just read. She met Arthur Montgomery's gaze, a gaze that seemed to assess not just her appearance but something deeper, as if searching for something specific within her. "I want to make something very clear." "Helen," he said, pronouncing her name with a disconcerting intimacy, "you are here because I wanted you here. Your debt was just a convenient pretext." "Debt?" The word escaped before she could contain it. A cold smile formed on Arthur's lips. "Your father owes $120,000 to the Montgomery Bank. A farm loan, accumulated fees, interest upon interest. Your little farm isn't worth half that, but I am a generous man. 3 months of your service and the debt will be forgiven." The floor seemed to have vanished from under Helen's feet. So that was it. Her father had sold her to settle a debt. The words service and 3 months echoed in her mind, along with the weight of the transparent dress on her skin. "What kind of service, sir?" Arthur rose from the armchair, walking slowly around her like a predator circling its prey. He stopped behind Helen, and she felt, more than heard, him lean close to her ear. "Companionship," he whispered. "Nothing more, nothing less. Far now." When he returned to her field of vision, Arthur's face had changed. The calculating expression had been replaced by a professional, almost indifferent mask. "Mrs. Carman will explain your daily tasks. I will dine at 8, and I expect you to join me. Wear what you find in the wardrobe in your room." And just like that, with no further explanation, Arthur Montgomery left the hall, leaving behind a Helen paralyzed by a mixture of fear, confusion, and a growing anger she could barely contain. At dinner, he barely spoke. He watched her eat, occasionally correcting the way she held her silverware or her posture in the chair. Back straight. Elbows off the table. "Don't cut all your food at once." Curt, precise orders, as if he were training a wild animal to be presented in society. When dessert was served, a crème brûlée, Helen could hardly swallow. Arthur finally returned to the reason for her presence. My family has a long tradition in the restoration and preservation of American historical heritage. This mansion is over 170 years old and has housed 3 generations of Montgomerys. To preserve it is to preserve our history. It's an impressive place, Helen replied, choosing her words carefully. Impressive, yes, and full of secrets. Secrets that must remain within these walls. Arthur paused, taking a sip of wine. You will play the piano for me every evening after dinner. We will begin tomorrow. But you said I shouldn't enter the music room without... I said you shouldn't enter without authorization, Arthur cut in, his voice suddenly gaining a hard edge. And now I am authorizing you. At 8 o'clock. In the music room. When Helen returned to her room that night, she found her cell phone on the bedside table. It had been taken from her suitcase and examined, she was sure. Next to it, a vase with white orchids and a handwritten note for the conservatory staircase. Don't forget. Helen picked up the phone, thinking of calling home, of demanding an explanation from her father, of asking for help, but the screen showed a complete lack of signal. She tried walking around the room, searching for any bar of connection, without success. She was isolated, just like the mansion in the Hudson Valley Hills. With the orchids in her hands, she left the room, looking for the staircase that led to the conservatory. The mansion at night was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, the wind passing through the old windows, the wood creaking with temperature changes, and something else. Like the distant echo of a melody. Following the almost imperceptible sound, Helen reached a corridor she had never been down before. To her right, a marble staircase spiraled downwards, lit only by small lights embedded in the steps. At the bottom of the stairs, a glass door revealed an indoor garden, a glass and metal greenhouse that housed tropical plants and a small water fountain. She left the orchids on the first step of the staircase, fulfilling one of the mansion's inexplicable rules. And then, instead of returning to her room as she should have, she followed the sound of the music that had now become clearer. The corridor led to a wing of the house she didn't know. A slightly ajar door allowed the melody to escape. Piano notes, executed with technical perfection, but laden with a sorrow so profound that Helen felt a tightness in her chest. Driven by a curiosity stronger than the fear of consequences, she gently pushed the door open. It was the music room, the forbidden place mentioned in the rules, a spacious room, with one wall made entirely of glass facing the forest, now just a dark mass under the continuing rain. In the center, a black Steinway grand piano gleaming like polished ebony. And sitting at the piano, his back to the door, was Arthur Montgomery. He played with his eyes closed, his fingers gliding over the keys with the intimacy of someone who knows not only the music, but the soul of the instrument. It was a piece Helen didn't recognize, complex, modern, full of dissonances that somehow resolved into harmony. That's when she noticed the portrait on the wall. A young man, perhaps 5 or 6 years younger than Arthur, with similar features but a smile that Arthur did not possess. Beneath the portrait, a golden plaque with the inscription, Andrew Montgomery, 1995-2021, forever in our melodies. Helen instinctively stepped back, remembering rule number 5, do not mention the name Andrew under any circumstances. But her movement made the wooden floor creak, and the music stopped abruptly. Arthur turned, his eyes finding hers like headlights cutting through the darkness. You broke 2 rules on your first day. His voice was low, dangerously controlled. You entered without permission. And you saw what you shouldn't have seen. Helen wanted to run, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. She wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come out. All she could do was hold his gaze, defying the 3rd rule as well. Arthur rose slowly from the piano bench and walked toward her. There was no anger on his face, which was even more terrifying. There was only a calculated intensity, a decision being made. Can you play this? He asked, pointing to the sheet music open on the piano. The question caught her completely off guard. I don't know this piece, sir. It's one of Andrew's compositions, Arthur said, the name of his brother leaving his lips like something both sacred and forbidden. My younger brother. The rules say I'm not supposed to... The rules are mine, Arthur cut in. I can break them if I want to. He moved closer, stopping just a step away. Helen could smell the faint scent of the expensive cologne he wore, mixed with something more personal, more intimate. You're not what I expected. Helen from Hollow Ridge, Arthur said, studying her face as if searching for something specific. There's something in your eyes, a strength that shouldn't be there. You don't know me, she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. A minimal smile appeared on his lips, and for the first time, Helen glimpsed something genuine behind the mask of coldness. No, I don't. Not yet. But I will. He stepped back, returning to the piano. Go back to your room. And tomorrow at 8, be here. We'll begin your lessons. Lessons. To the piano. Of behavior. Of life, Helen. Arthur slid a finger over the polished surface of the Steinway. You are here to learn, and I am here to teach you. Helen found herself trapped between fear and curiosity, between revolt and a strange, inexplicable attraction. Without another word, she turned to leave, feeling the weight of Arthur's gaze on her back. One last thing, he called out when she was already in the hallway. The rules exist for a reason. Breaking them has consequences. She didn't turn around, didn't answer. She kept walking, with firm steps despite her trembling legs, back to the room that would be her prison for the next 3 months. In her mind, like a mantra to maintain her sanity, she repeated, 3 months. Just 3 months. And then I'll be free. But something inside Helen already knew that nothing would be that simple, that by entering that mansion, by looking into Arthur Montgomery's eyes, she had started something that would not end in 3 months, something that might never end at all. That night, lying in the bed too large for one person, Helen dreamed of hands gliding over ivory keys, of dark eyes watching her, of secrets whispered in empty corridors. And she woke up with the certainty that, to survive the next 3 months, she would have to do more than follow rules. She would have to understand what was really happening in that mansion, who Arthur Montgomery really was, and why, of all the girls in Appalachia, he had chosen her. The first few weeks at the Montgomery estate passed like a strange fever dream. Helen established a routine that oscillated between moments of absolute boredom and unbearable tension. In the mornings, she accompanied Mrs. Carman in managing the house, not as a maid, but as a kind of apprentice, observing how the housekeeper commanded the staff, organized meals, and kept every inch of the mansion in perfect condition. In the afternoons, she had lessons in etiquette, diction, and social behavior with a tutor hired especially for her, an elegant woman with a refined East Coast accent who treated her like a rough stone to be polished. And at night, always at 8, the piano lessons with Arthur. It was these moments that disturbed Helen the most. Sitting next to him on the narrow Steinway bench, feeling the warmth of his body, the scent of his expensive cologne, his controlled breath when he leaned in to correct the position of her fingers on the keys. Arthur was a demanding and impatient teacher. But there were moments, brief and rare, when something genuine appeared in his eyes when Helen correctly executed a difficult passage. Again, he would say without direct praise, but with a glint of satisfaction she had learned to recognize. From Measure 23. In the first few nights he chose only simple classical pieces, Bach, Mozart, small Chopin studies. But as Helen demonstrated skill, Arthur began to introduce more complex compositions, and eventually Andrew's compositions. These were the most difficult, not technically, but emotionally. Pieces laden with a melancholy so profound that Helen often felt tears in her eyes while playing them. And in those moments, Arthur watched her with an almost painful intensity, as if searching for something in her reactions. One night after nearly 3 weeks at the mansion, Helen finally summoned the courage to ask, "Why are these songs so sad?" Arthur, who was standing by the window looking out at the darkness of the forest, turned slowly. Andrew composed most of them in the last months of his life. He knew he was dying. It was the first time Arthur had spoken openly about his brother. Helen remained silent, fearing that any word might make him close up again. Leukemia, Arthur continued, his voice controlled, but with an underlying tension. Diagnosed too late. He was 26 and had a brilliant future as a composer. I offered the best treatments, international specialists, transplants, experimental therapies. Nothing worked. Helen lowered her eyes to the piano keys, feeling the weight of the story. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," Arthur replied with sudden harshness. "Pity doesn't bring anyone back." The only thing we can do for the dead is keep their memories alive. He approached, stopping behind Helen, who was still seated at the piano. Play the Elegy in C minor. It's his last composition. Helen positioned her fingers on the keys and began to play. It was the most difficult piece Arthur had ever given her, with tempo changes, complex chords, and a melody that seemed to converse with the silence between the notes. In the first few measures, she made several mistakes, her fingers stumbling over the transitions. "Focus," Arthur ordered, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Don't just play with your fingers. Play with your soul." His touch, firm and warm through the thin fabric of the dress Helen wore, sent shivers down her spine. It was the first time Arthur had intentionally touched her, beyond the brief contacts when correcting her posture or the position of her fingers. Helen closed her eyes, trying to push away the awareness of the heat of his hands and concentrate on the music. Slowly, as if the piece were speaking directly to her, Helen began to find the rhythm, the feeling. Her fingers glided over the keys, dancing between the notes with growing confidence. Arthur's hands slid from her shoulders to her neck, his thumb tracing gentle circles at the base of her nape. It was no longer the touch of a teacher or an employer. It was something more intimate, more dangerous. The music grew in intensity, and Helen felt her heart race not just from the technical challenge, but from his proximity. When she reached the final cadenza, the piece dissolving into whispered notes, Arthur's hands moved up to her hair, his fingers intertwining in the dark strands. Helen let her hands fall into her lap, the last note still vibrating in the air. Neither she nor Arthur moved for long seconds, caught in a moment of tension that seemed on the verge of shattering into 1,000 pieces. "You play like her," Arthur said finally. His voice so low Helen could barely hear it. "Her?" Arthur's fingers abruptly withdrew from her hair. When Helen turned to look at him, his expression had closed off again, the impenetrable mask back in place. "That's enough for tonight. Go back to your room." The curt order and the sudden mood swing left Helen confused and frustrated. But she knew Arthur well enough by now to know that pressing for answers would only make him withdraw further. Without arguing, she rose from the piano bench and walked to the door. "Helen," Arthur called before she left, "tomorrow there will be an event here at the mansion, a business dinner. I want you to wear the red dress Mrs. Carmen will leave in your room. And I want you to play for my guests. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Like everything that came from Arthur Montgomery." The next morning, the buzz in the mansion announced that the event would be much larger than a simple business dinner. Extra staff had been hired for the occasion, florists delivered elaborate arrangements, and the kitchen team worked from dawn on a 7-course menu. When Helen came down for breakfast, she found Mrs. Carmen more tense than usual, giving orders and personally checking every detail. "Mr. Montgomery asked me to inform you that you will have a beauty session at 4 in the afternoon, the housekeeper said, barely looking at Helen as she checked a list in her hands. "Hair, makeup, manicure. He wants you to be impeccable tonight." "Who is coming to this dinner?" Helen asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Mrs. Carmen finally looked up from the list, a look of mild surprise on her face. "The cream of New York society, child. Politicians, business leaders, artists. Mr. Montgomery rarely opens the doors of the mansion, but when he does, it's an event talked about for weeks." Helen felt a chill in her stomach. It was one thing to play the piano for Arthur, in the isolation of the music room. It was another thing entirely to perform for a group of wealthy and influential people, people who would surely notice every mistake, every hesitation. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." "It's not for you to decide," Mrs. Carmen replied, not cruelly, but simply stating a fact. "Mr. Montgomery rarely makes demands of his guests. When he does, it is for a purpose." At noon, Helen received a box in her room, inside a pearl necklace and matching earrings. The card simply read, "To complement the dress, A.M." At 4, as promised, a team of professionals transformed her room into a small beauty salon. One woman washed and treated her hair, applying products Helen could never have afforded on her bakery salary. Another took care of her nails, turning them into small red jewels. The makeup artist worked for nearly an hour, applying layers of products that enhanced her features without looking excessive. When she was finally alone and could put on the red dress, Helen barely recognized herself in the newly installed mirror in her room. The dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace, hugging her curves like a second skin, with a low back that dipped to the middle of her spine. It wasn't vulgar. It was elegant, sophisticated, and infinitely more expensive than any piece of clothing she had ever owned. With the pearl necklace adorning her neck and her black hair arranged in soft waves, Helen looked like she had stepped out of the pages of a fashion magazine. At 8 o'clock sharp, as the first cars began to arrive, Mrs. Carman knocked on her door. "It's time," she announced, examining Helen with a critical eye. For a moment, Helen thought she saw something like approval in the housekeeper's eyes. "Mr. Montgomery is waiting for you in the main hall." Helen's heart hammered against her chest as she descended the stairs. Each step in the high heels, another new item in her life, felt like a balancing act between confidence and terror. Voices and laughter already filled the ground floor, and she could hear the clinking of champagne glasses and the elegant murmur of sophisticated conversations. Arthur waited at the foot of the stairs, impeccable in a tailored black suit. For the first time, Helen saw him smile genuinely when he saw her, a brief smile, but one that completely transformed his austere face. "You look stunning," he said, offering his arm for her to descend the last few steps. "Thank you for the dress," Helen replied, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "And the jewelry." "They are just accessories," Arthur said, his gaze sweeping over her face with an intensity that made Helen blush. "You would be stunning even without them." The unexpected compliment caught her off guard. Before she could respond, Arthur led her into the hall where dozens of guests were mingling, all in formal attire, all clearly belonging to a world Helen had only seen in magazines and movies. "This is Helen," Arthur introduced her to a small group, "a talented pianist who is staying with me temporarily." Helen noted the careful choice of words. "Not a guest, not an employee. With me temporarily." A description vague enough to make the guests curious, but too polite to ask direct questions. For the next hour, Arthur led her from group to group, always keeping a possessive hand on the small of her back, always introducing her in the same enigmatic way. Helen watched how he transformed in these social settings, still reserved, but with a calculated charm that captivated everyone. It was clear that Arthur Montgomery was more than respected in these circles. He was feared and admired in equal parts. Politicians treated him with deference, business leaders sought his approval, and the women present, many of them stunning and clearly interested, cast envious glances at Helen. It was during one of these introductions that Helen noticed an older woman staring at her intently from across the hall. Elegant, with perfectly coiffed grey hair and a set of sapphires that matched her eyes, the woman made no attempt to disguise her interest. "Who is that lady?" Helen asked Arthur discreetly when they had a moment alone. Arthur followed her gaze, and Helen felt his body stiffen instantly. "My stepmother," he replied, his voice suddenly cold. "Regina Montgomery. A person you should avoid at all costs." As if she had heard her name, Regina began to walk in their direction, a calculated smile on her red-painted lips. "Arthur, dear," she said, leaning in to kiss her stepson's cheek, who remained as rigid as a statue. "What a marvelous event. Your father would have been proud." "I highly doubt that," Arthur replied dryly, "and you know it." Regina laughed, a melodious sound that didn't reach her eyes, before turning her attention to Helen. "And this must be the new protégé," she said, examining Helen from head to toe with a look that made her feel exposed despite the elegant dress. "Surprising how you always find girls who look so much alike, Arthur. It's almost obsessive." Helen felt Arthur tense even more beside her. "Helen, please check with Mrs. Carman if everything is ready for your performance," he said, clearly wanting to remove her from the conversation. But before Helen could withdraw, Regina lightly touched her arm. "You play the piano, don't you? I heard you have talent. Andrew played beautifully as well." She paused dramatically, observing the effect of the forbidden name on Arthur. What a shame that talents are sometimes wasted so prematurely. "Enough, Regina." Arthur's voice was low, but filled with a contained fury that made nearby guests cast nervous glances in their direction. Regina smiled again, pleased with the reaction she had provoked. "Just being polite to your new-to-acquisition?" She turned to Helen. "Enjoy your time here, dear. The girls Arthur brings to this house never stay for long. Not after they find out the truth." With that, she gracefully walked away, leaving Helen confused and Arthur visibly disturbed. "Ignore her," he said, regaining his composure. "Regina lives to cause chaos. It's the only thing that gives her pleasure since my father died, and she discovered she wouldn't inherit what she expected." "She said the girls you bring never stay for long," Helen said, unable to contain her curiosity. "Were there others before me?" Arthur's eyes darkened. "Don't ask about things that don't concern you. Helen, if I'm replacing someone, I have the right to know." A musician announced that dinner would be served in 15 minutes, saving Arthur from answering. He placed a firm hand on Helen's arm and led her to a quieter corner of the hall. "You are not replacing anyone," he said finally, his voice controlled. "You are here because I wanted you to be here. That is all." "Why?" Helen insisted. "Why me? What do you really want from me?" Arthur studied her for a long moment, as if deciding how much he could reveal. "When you play Andrew's compositions," he said finally, "there is something in the way your fingers find the keys, how your body responds to the music. It's as if you understand what he meant to say, as if you can reach him somehow." The answer was not what Helen expected. It was too honest, too vulnerable to come from the Arthur Montgomery she knew. "Is that why you brought me here? To be some kind of musical medium?" A shadow of irritation crossed Arthur's face. "I brought you here because I could, because your father had a debt and I had the means to exploit it. The rest just happened." The bluntness of the answer hit Helen like a slap. It was the truth, of course. But hearing Arthur say it, after weeks of a strange intimacy built over the piano, hurt more than it should have. "I see," she said, taking a step back. "I'm just a business transaction. Thank you for clarifying." Something flickered in Arthur's eyes. Remorse, perhaps? But before he could respond, Mrs. Carman appeared at his side. "The guests are being called for dinner, sir. And the piano has been prepared according to your instructions." Arthur nodded, still looking at Helen. "This conversation is not over," he said quietly. "But now we have roles to play." Dinner proceeded like a well-rehearsed play. Helen was seated to Arthur's right at the head of the long table, a position of honor that did not go unnoticed by the other guests. The food was extraordinary. Elaborate dishes Helen barely recognized, expensive wines she drank cautiously, artistic desserts that looked too good to be eaten. Throughout the meal, she felt Regina's gaze on her, assessing, speculating. And whenever she could, Arthur's stepmother made veiled comments about the past, about Andrew, about patterns that repeat themselves. After dessert, Arthur stood up, naturally silencing all conversations. "I thank you all for your presence on this special evening," he said, his deep voice echoing in the dining hall. "As you know, I rarely open the doors of the Montgomery estate, but tonight we have something unique to celebrate." The guests exchanged curious glances. Helen felt her stomach sink. What was Arthur planning? "Today marks the 3rd anniversary of my brother Andrew's passing." A dense silence fell over the hall. Clearly no one expected Arthur to mention his brother publicly. Andrew left behind a musical legacy that few know. His compositions, which he never wished to publish in his lifetime, are the works of a misunderstood genius. Arthur paused, looking directly at Helen. "Tonight, for the first time, one of those compositions will be played publicly, and I have the pleasure of introducing the person who will bring this work to life, Helen." All eyes turned to her. Helen felt the blood drain from her face. She had expected to play something simple, a well-known classical piece. Not one of Andrew's compositions, and certainly not on an occasion so charged with meaning. Arthur extended his hand to her, an invitation impossible to refuse. With trembling legs, Helen stood up and allowed him to guide her to the main hall, where the Steinway had been moved to the center, illuminated by strategically placed spotlights. "I can't do this," she whispered desperately when they were out of the guests' earshot. "I'm not ready." "You are," Arthur replied, his hand firm on her back. "I would not expose you to failure, Helen. Trust me." Trust, a strange word coming from a man who had bought her to settle her father's debt. A man who kept secrets in every corner of the mansion. A man whose eyes now pleaded for something Helen couldn't name. The guests settled into chairs and sofas around the piano. Regina sat in a prime position, her eyes never leaving Helen's face. Arthur led Helen to the piano and, to her surprise, sat down next to her on the bench. "We will play together," he announced to the guests. "Requiem for a Lost Love," Andrew's last composition adapted for 4 hands. Helen looked at him in shock. They had never practiced together, let alone such a complex piece. "Follow my lead," Arthur murmured, placing the sheet music in front of them. "You know this piece. Just feel it." Before Helen could protest, Arthur began to play. His fingers found the bass keys of the piano, establishing a melodic foundation that was both familiar and new to Helen. It was a version of the Elegy in C minor she had been practicing, but expanded, transformed into something even more powerful. When it was her turn to enter, Helen hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, as if an external force were guiding her hands, she began to play the treble part, her notes intertwining with Arthur's in an intimate dance that made her heart race. The music grew between them, becoming more and more intense. Helen's fingers occasionally brushed against Arthur's as they crossed territories, each touch sending shivers up her arm. She lost herself in the composition, forgetting the guests, forgetting Regina, forgetting even who she was and why she was there. There was only the music, only Arthur beside her, only the growing warmth between their bodies as they created something beautiful together. When they reached the climax of the piece, Helen looked at Arthur and found his eyes fixed on her, not on the keys. There was something wild in that gaze, something dangerous and vulnerable at the same time. For an instant, she saw through the mask of coldness to the broken man beneath, a man shattered by loss, consumed by guilt, desperate for connection. The music dissolved into whispered notes, and when the last vibration faded, the silence that followed was almost sacred. No one moved, no one applauded immediately. The guests seemed as affected by the performance as the musicians themselves. It was Regina who broke the spell, rising to applaud with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying a thread of malice. "I can almost see Andrew in her, can't you, Arthur? Is that what you look for in all of them? A ghost from the past?" Arthur's body went rigid beside Helen. His eyes, previously soft and open, hardened instantly. "I think it's time for you to go, Regina," he said, his voice dangerously low, but Regina wasn't finished. "The guests deserve to know the truth about your muse," she continued, gesturing toward Helen, "about how you found her, about how you bought her, just as you tried to buy Elena for Andrew." The name, Elena, hit Helen like an electric shock. There was another one who came before, one who, from the momentary look of panic on Arthur's face, meant much more than he would ever admit. "Enough," Arthur's voice thundered through the hall. He stood up abruptly, the piano bench scraping backward. "This reception is over. I thank you all for coming, but I must ask you to leave now." The murmur of confusion that followed was interrupted by a sound no one expected, Helen's laughter. It was not a laugh of joy, but of sudden, bitter understanding. "Elena," she said, pronouncing the name carefully. "That's why I'm here. It's not about the music, it's about the name." Arthur turned to her, his face a mask of fragile control. "Helen, go to your room now." For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Helen did not obey. Instead, she stood up and faced Arthur directly. Who was she? What happened to her? Is she the one I'm not supposed to talk about? Just like I'm not supposed to talk about Andrew. The questions poured out in a torrent, fueled by weeks of secrets and half-truths. The guests, sensing the imminent explosion, began to withdraw discreetly, led by a visibly uncomfortable Richard. Only Regina remained, savoring the chaos she had created. "Ask him," she said to Helen, pointing at Arthur. "Ask him why Andrew really died. Ask him what happened to Elena on the night everything fell apart." "Out!" Arthur roared, completely losing his composure. "Get out of my house!" 2 security guards appeared beside Regina, ready to escort her out by force if necessary. "You can't bury the truth forever, Arthur," she said, as she was led away. "This girl deserves to know what kind of game she's involved in." When the last guest had left and the mansion doors had closed, Arthur and Helen were left alone in the empty hall, the piano between them like a physical barrier to the emotional abyss that had opened up. "I want the truth," Helen said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "All of it. Now." Arthur studied her for a long moment, as if assessing how much she could bear. "The truth can be more damaging than silence, Helen." I don't care. I'm trapped in this mansion, sold like a commodity, treated as a substitute for someone I don't even know. I deserve to know why. Arthur walked to a side table where a bottle of whiskey and glasses waited. He poured a generous measure and downed it in a single motion before turning back to Helen. Eleanor was Andrew's girlfriend, he said finally. A pianist like you, from a simple background like you. They met at a conservatory where she was on a scholarship. It was love at first sight. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. The parallels were disturbing. My father didn't approve. The Montgomerys don't mix with common people. The contempt in Arthur's voice as he repeated his father's words was palpable. Andrew was always the rebel of the family, the artist, the dreamer. I was the practical son, the one who would take over the business. Our father cast us in those roles from an early age. Arthur poured himself another drink, but this time he just swirled the amber liquid in the glass, watching it as if he could see the past reflected there. When Andrew got sick, he and Eleanor had been together for almost 2 years. They lived in an apartment downtown, living on music and love like two characters from a romance novel. A sad smile touched Arthur's lips. My father saw the illness as an opportunity. Bring him back home, he said, where we can properly care for him. What he really wanted was to separate Andrew from Elena, to bring him back into the family fold before it was too late. And you helped, Helen deduced. Arthur's eyes met hers. Filled with an old deep guilt, I helped. I convinced Andrew that the best treatments were available here, that he needed peace and quiet to recover, that Elena could visit him whenever she wanted. He took a painful pause. All lies. As soon as Andrew moved in here, my father hired security to keep Elena away. He told Andrew that she had given up on him, that she didn't want to see a sick, weak man. And Andrew believed that? Not at first. He fought, he yelled, he threatened to leave. But he was too weak. And then the letters started arriving. Letters, supposedly from Eleanor. Cruel letters explaining why she couldn't be with him anymore, how his illness was a burden, how she had found someone else. Arthur swallowed the second shot of whiskey. My father forged them, of course, or had them forged. Eleanor was sending real letters, letters of love and support, but they never reached Andrew. The horror of the situation began to unfold in Helen's mind. What happened to her? To Elena? She didn't give up. She tried to break into the estate several times. On her last attempt, the guards hired by my father were overly zealous. Arthur's voice broke. She fell from the security fence. A 15-foot drop. Broke her neck. Helen brought a hand to her mouth, horrified. Did Andrew know? Not immediately. My father covered up the accident. He paid her family a considerable sum to keep quiet. But Andrew was getting worse, and in his last days, delirious with fever and pain, he started calling for her. He begged to see her one last time. Arthur placed the empty glass on the table and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. When he spoke again, his voice was choked with emotion. I couldn't bear to see my brother suffer anymore, so I told him the truth. About the fake letters, about the accident, about how our father had manipulated everything. What did he do? Nothing. He couldn't do anything. He was too weak to even cry. Arthur turned to face Helen, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He died that night. The doctor said it was the leukemia, but I know it was a broken heart. It was knowing that the love of his life died trying to get to him, while he believed he had been abandoned. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Helen remained motionless, absorbing the terrible story, finally understanding why she was there, why Arthur had chosen her. And your father? She finally asked. He died 6 months later. A heart attack, the doctors said. Arthur's face hardened. But I know it was the poison I put in his whiskey day after day, in doses too small to be detected. A slow death, like the one he imposed on my brother. The confession fell between them like a bomb. Helen instinctively recoiled, shocked not only by the revelation, but by the coldness with which Arthur delivered it. You killed your own father. I delivered justice, Arthur corrected, and ever since I've been trying to atone, to preserve Andrew's memory, to complete what he left unfinished. That's why I'm here, Helen said, the pieces finally fitting together. Because I look like her. Because I come from a simple place like her. Because I play the piano like her. I'm just her replacement. Arthur took a step toward her, but Helen stepped back. At first, yes, he admitted. When Thompson showed me your picture, when he mentioned your musical talent, when he said your name, so similar to hers, it felt like a sign. A chance to correct the past somehow. By bringing me here as a prisoner, Helen's voice trembled with indignation. By buying me from my own father? I know it was wrong, Arthur said, his face showing a vulnerability Helen had never seen before. But I didn't expect you. I didn't expect you to be so strong, so defiant. I didn't expect that playing with you would make me feel alive again. He took another step toward her, and this time Helen did not retreat. There was something magnetic in Arthur's raw honesty, in the way he had finally let all his masks fall. Tonight, when we played together, he continued, now just a step away, it wasn't Elena I saw. It was you, Helen, only you. The confession hung between them, charged with possibilities and dangers. Helen felt torn between revulsion for what Arthur had done and an undeniable attraction to the vulnerable man who was finally revealing himself. I should leave, she said, but without conviction. Go back to Hollow Ridge. You can go if you want, Arthur replied, surprising her. Your father's debt is forgiven, regardless of your decision. You are free, Helen, you always were. The revelation hit her like a wave. She could have left at any time, or was this just another manipulation, now that he had exposed too much? Why should I believe you now? Because I have nothing left to hide, Arthur said, his voice low and intense. No secrets, no lies. Just a broken man who found something unexpected when he was only looking for a ghost. He raised his hand, hesitant, and touched Helen's face, the first truly intimate touch between them. His fingers traced the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her heart race. Stay, he whispered. Not as a replacement. Not as an obligation, but as yourself, Helen. Just you. His touch was warm against her skin, the promise in his eyes dangerous and seductive. Helen knew she should pull back, that she should flee this mansion and the dark secrets it held. But something kept her there. Not the chains of a debt, but the invisible threads of a connection she could no longer deny. I need time, she said finally, pulling away from his touch. To think, to decide. Arthur nodded, letting his hand fall to his side. All the time you need. The choice is yours now. As Helen walked up the stairs to her room, feeling the weight of Arthur's gaze on her back, she knew she was entering territory even more dangerous than before. A territory where she was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a willing participant in whatever dark game Arthur Montgomery was playing. And the most frightening part was that, despite everything she had discovered, a part of her yearned to find out just how far that game could take them. Dawn came slowly to the Montgomery estate, the first rays of sun filtering lazily through the curtains of Helen's room. She hadn't slept. She had spent the entire night turning over every revelation, every word exchanged with Arthur after the disastrous dinner. His confession about murdering his own father, the tragic story of Andrew and Eleanor, the truth about why she was there, and, more disturbing than anything, the growing certainty that despite every reason she had to run, something was holding her to this place, to this man. The phone beside the bed rang, making her jump. In all the weeks she had spent at the mansion, that device had never been used. Hello? She answered, hesitant. Helen. Arthur's voice was grave and urgent. I need you to come to the music room immediately. What happened? Regina. The name was spoken like a curse. She was here during the night. We need to talk. Before Helen could reply, the call ended. Her heart racing, she dressed quickly, opting for jeans and a simple blouse she had brought from Hollow Ridge, not the elegant dresses Arthur had provided. A small rebellion, an assertion of identity. When she reached the music room, she found Arthur standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his body as tense as a violin string about to snap. He hadn't slept either. It was evident from the shadows under his eyes, the stubble on his chin, the usually impeccable hair now disheveled. What did Regina do? Helen asked, stopping at a safe distance. Arthur turned, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her hold her breath. She went to the police, told them a distorted version of what happened to my father, suggested I poisoned him to take control of the Montgomery empire. Helen felt her blood run cold. But You confessed that to me last night. To you, Arthur said, walking toward her. Only to you. And there's no proof, not after so much time, unless I confirm what you told me, Helen completed, understanding the gravity of the situation. Regina always suspected, but she could never prove it. Now she thinks she can get to me through you. Arthur stopped less than a yard from her. She will come to you, offer you money, promises. She'll say she's concerned for your well-being, that she wants to help you escape from me. Helen crossed her arms, studying his face. And how do you know that? Because I know Regina. She has hated me since my father married her when I was 15. Andrew was the only one she tolerated, because he was younger, more malleable. When Andrew died, and I confronted my father about his role in it, Regina understood she would never have the control she desired over the Montgomery fortune. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of nervousness. And when my father died, leaving everything to me, her hatred became an obsession. Why are you telling me this? Helen asked, her suspicion evident. To manipulate my reaction when Regina comes to me. The question hit Arthur like a physical blow. He took a step back, his face registering a mix of surprise and hurt. I'm telling you because I promised not to hide anything from you anymore. His voice took on a tone of restrained intensity. Because after last night, after we played together, after I revealed my worst secrets, I don't want any more lies between us. The ensuing silence was charged with tension. Helen wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this new vulnerability was genuine. But she also knew that Arthur Montgomery was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, to manipulating situations and people for his own ends. What do you want me to do then? She finally asked. If Regina comes to me. Arthur took another step toward her, now close enough for her to feel the heat emanating from him, to catch the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the raw aroma of a sleepless night. I want you to do what your heart tells you, he answered, surprising her once again. If you decide to help her, to accept what she offers and report me, then that is what I must deserve. The sincerity in his voice was disarming. Helen studied his face, searching for signs of falsehood, of manipulation. She found only exhaustion, vulnerability, and something else, a genuine fear of losing her. And if I decide to stay? The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. If I decide to believe you. Arthur's eyes lit up with a hope so raw and desperate that Helen felt her heart clench. Then we would have a chance, he said, his voice almost a whisper. A chance to find out what this is between us, without ghosts of the past, without obligations or debts. Just us, Helen, just you and me. He slowly raised his hand, hesitant, and touched her face. This time Helen didn't pull away. The touch was warm, gentle, so different from the image of the cold, controlling man she had known in the first few weeks. Can this be real? She asked, allowing herself for the first time to contemplate the possibility of a future with Arthur, after how it all began. I don't know, he answered honestly. I only know that when I play with you, when I'm with you, I feel alive again. And that has nothing to do with Elena or Andrew or the past. It's something new, something unexpected. His fingers traced the outline of Helen's lips, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. All the tension of the past weeks, all the stolen glances, all the moments of restrained proximity during the piano lessons seemed to converge on this moment. May I? Arthur asked, his gaze shifting between her eyes and her lips. Helen responded by leaning forward, closing the distance between them. The first kiss was hesitant, almost reverent. Arthur's lips met hers with a softness that seemed impossible for a man so accustomed to control and power. It was Helen who deepened the contact, her hands finding their way to the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. Something broke in Arthur at that moment. With a low groan, he wrapped his arms around her, the kiss transforming into something more urgent, more desperate. Years of loneliness, guilt, and repressed desire seemed to explode between them. His hands roamed over Helen's back, pressing her against his body as if he feared she might disappear at any moment. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Helen could see an expression on Arthur's face she had never witnessed before, a mixture of awe, desire, and fear. This changes everything, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. Or maybe it just makes everything more complicated, Helen replied, returning to reality. Regina will still come after me. The police might still investigate. And there's my family, the debt. The debt is cancelled, Arthur said firmly. I've already given the orders. And as for Regina and the police, he hesitated as if weighing his words. I have resources, Helen. I can protect your family. I can protect us. She took a step back, studying him with a new critical eye. With money? Influence? The same tools your father used to separate Andrew and Elena. The question struck Arthur like a slap. He blinked, surprised by the sudden change in tone. It's not the same, isn't it? Helen crossed her arms. You can't just erase problems with money, Arthur. You can't control everyone and everything around you to create the world you want. I'm not trying to control you, he protested. Aren't you? Helen raised an eyebrow. Then why did you bring me here? Why did you isolate me in this mansion, dress me as you wished, turn me into something I'm not? Arthur ran a hand over his face, clearly disturbed by the turn the conversation had taken. I was wrong, he finally admitted. At first, yes, I wanted to recreate something, to correct the past somehow. But that changed, Helen, you changed that. How can I be sure? How can I trust that I'm not just a project for you, a way to atone for your guilt? The question hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. Arthur faced her for a long moment, as if struggling to find the right words. I can't prove it with words, he said at last. I can only show you with actions, with time. Just then the phone in the office rang, interrupting the moment. Arthur answered with a curt yes, listened for a few seconds, and hung up with a grave expression. Regina is here, he announced, at the front gate. With 2 police officers, Helen's heart pounded. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than she expected. What are you going to do? She asked Arthur. The question is, what are you going to do? He stared at her intently. They will certainly want to talk to you. I could stop them, could send them away, use my influence, but I won't. This is your choice, Helen, your decision. The offer of freedom, of genuine choice, took Helen by surprise. After weeks of being controlled, manipulated, and guided in every aspect of her life at the mansion, Arthur was handing her the power to decide her fate, and his. I'll talk to them, Helen decided. Alone. Arthur nodded, the tension evident in his clenched jaw, but he didn't protest. I'll be in my study if you need me. When Helen descended to the entrance hall, she found Regina Montgomery impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, flanked by 2 men in suits, one clearly a lawyer from the way he held a document folder, the other with the unmistakable posture of a plainclothes police officer. The young pianist. Regina greeted her with a cold smile. We were just talking about you. Helen kept her spine straight, her chin up, refusing to be intimidated. What can I do for you, ma'am? It's more about what we can do for you, my dear. Regina gestured to the empty hall. May we speak in private? Away from Arthur's ears. Helen led the group to the living room, noticing how Regina's eyes scanned every detail of the mansion with a mixture of nostalgia and bitterness. Once they were all settled, Regina got straight to the point. I have reason to believe you are in danger in this house, that Arthur Montgomery brought you here under false pretenses, possibly as part of a disturbing pattern of behavior that began with his brother's death. The man Helen suspected was a police officer watched her reaction closely. What kind of danger? Helen asked, keeping her voice neutral. Arthur is a disturbed man, Regina continued. Since his brother's death, he has developed an obsession with replacing what he lost, with recreating the relationship Andrew had with Elena. And how would you know that? Because there were others before you. Regina signaled to the lawyer, who opened his folder and took out several photographs. Young women, similar in appearance, all with some connection to music, all brought to this mansion under different pretexts, all eventually disappearing, with vague explanations or generous payments to remain silent. The photographs showed 3 different young women, all with dark hair like Helen's, all bearing a superficial resemblance that was unsettling. What happened to them? Helen asked, a knot forming in her stomach. Nothing illegal, apparently, the officer interjected, speaking for the first time. They received financial compensation, signed non-disclosure agreements, some left the country, but the pattern is concerning. And then there is the matter of Mr. Montgomery Sr., Regina continued. His sudden death, shortly after a confrontation with Arthur about Andrew's death. The autopsy was inconclusive, but I have always suspected. Helen kept her face impassive, despite the turmoil in her mind. Regina's revelations only confirmed parts of what Arthur had already confessed, but the photographs of the other girls, the previous Elenas, were a new and disturbing element. "What exactly do you want from me?" Helen finally asked. Regina smiled, a calculated smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your testimony, my dear. Anything Arthur may have said or done to suggest his guilt in his father's death. Or any inappropriate behavior toward you." She paused dramatically. "In return, I can offer protection. And financial compensation, of course. Your family in Hollow Ridge could live a very comfortable life." The officer watched Helen with intensity. "If you are being held here against your will, Miss Evans, we can intervene immediately." Helen looked at the photographs spread across the coffee table. Girls like her, chosen like her, possibly manipulated like her. It was disturbing to think she was just the latest in a line of replacements for Eleanor. And yet, there had been something genuine in Arthur's eyes when he kissed her, when he said that what was happening between them was new, unexpected. "May I hold these for a moment?" Helen asked, buying time to think. Regina nodded, exchanging a meaningful look with the officer. "Take all the time you need, dear. This is an important decision." Helen stood up, the photographs in her hand, and walked to the window overlooking the mansion's gardens. The three visitors waited in silence, watching her. In that moment, with the weight of the decision on her shoulders, Helen thought about everything she had experienced in the past few weeks. The control, the manipulation, the half-truths, but also the music they had created together, the vulnerability Arthur had finally revealed, the kiss they had shared, filled with the promise of something real, something true. She thought of her family in Hollow Ridge, of the debt Arthur had promised to cancel, of the opportunities he could provide with his power and influence. And she thought of Regina, whose motives for destroying Arthur were as personal as Arthur's motives for bringing Helen to the mansion. When she turned back to the three visitors, Helen had made her decision. "Arthur told me everything," she said, her voice firm, "about Andrew and Elena, about how his father manipulated the situation, about how he blames himself for what happened." Regina leaned forward, eager. "Did he confess anything about his father's death?" Helen looked directly into the older woman's eyes. "He confessed that his guilt consumes him every day, that he was looking for some form of redemption. And yes, he brought me here because of my resemblance to Elena, my name, my talent for piano." The officer began to write something in a small notebook. "But," Helen continued, "at no point have I been held here against my will. The contract I signed has a termination clause I can invoke at any time. I have been treated with respect, given an education, opportunities I would never have had in Hollow Ridge." "He's manipulating you," Regina insisted, "just like he manipulated the others. Look at the photographs." Helen glanced at the images in her hands. "I see women who vaguely look like me, who may have been here before, who may have had their own arrangements with Arthur." She faced Regina again. "What I don't see is proof of any crime." The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Miss Evans, I understand your hesitation. But if Mr. Montgomery confessed anything related to his father's death—" "He confessed nothing of the sort," Helen interrupted, the lie slipping easily from her lips. "He only said he felt responsible for not protecting Andrew, for allowing his father to separate them." Regina stood up, frustration evident on her face. "You're protecting him. Why, what did he promise you? Money, power, love?" She spat the last word as if it were an obscenity. Helen maintained her composure, handing the photographs back to the lawyer. "I'm not protecting anyone. I'm telling the truth. I came to the Montgomery estate of my own free will, as part of a professional agreement. I have been treated with dignity, and I intend to remain here for as long as I see fit." The officer closed his notebook with a sigh. Without a formal accusation or evidence of coercion, "There's not much we can do here," he said to Regina. Arthur's stepmother looked furious, but controlled. "You will regret this decision," she said to Helen, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag. "When he grows tired of you, when he finds the next replacement for his precious ghost, remember that I offered you a way out." Helen held her gaze without flinching. "If that day comes, I will know how to find my own way." After the unwanted visitors had left, Helen remained in the living room for several long minutes, absorbing the weight of her decision. She had lied to protect Arthur. She had chosen to stay at the mansion, despite the disturbing evidence of the others before her. Was this the right decision? Or just another step down a dangerous path? It was Mrs. Carman who interrupted her thoughts, appearing silently at the living room door. "Mr. Montgomery would like to see you in the music room," the housekeeper said, her face as expressionless as ever. "Thank you." "Mrs. Carman," Helen replied, getting up. Before the older woman could leave, Helen called to her, "How long have you worked for the Montgomery family?" Mrs. Carman hesitated, surprised by the personal question. 32 years, since Arthur was a child. "So you knew all of them, the other girls who came before me?" A shadow crossed the housekeeper's face. "I did," she admitted. 3 young women, all musicians, all hopeful. None stayed for more than 2 months. What happened to them?" Mrs. Carman studied Helen for a long moment, as if deciding how much she could reveal. "They weren't what he was looking for," she answered finally. "They weren't strong enough. They didn't challenge him. And me." A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the housekeeper's lips. "You're different. You remind him of life, not just of death." And with that she withdrew silently, leaving Helen with more questions than answers. In the music room, Arthur was seated at the piano, softly playing a melody Helen didn't recognize. He stopped playing when he saw her enter, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Is Regina gone?" he asked, though it was obvious he already knew the answer. "Yes, with her officer and her lawyer." Helen walked to the piano but didn't sit. "They showed me photographs of the others." Arthur closed his eyes briefly, his face contorting in an expression of pain. "I was going to tell you about them," he said. "Eventually. How many?" 3 in 2 years. Arthur rose from the piano bench, facing Helen's accusatory gaze. "None of them were mistreated or held against their will. They received generous compensation when they left. Why did they leave?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Arthur looked away toward the window, toward the gardens where rain was beginning to fall again, as if the weather reflected the turmoil inside the mansion. "Because they weren't you," he answered finally, his voice low and intense. "Because they were shadows, echoes. They never challenged me, never broke rules, never looked into my eyes the way you do, the way you are right now." Helen crossed her arms, unconvinced. "Regina says you're obsessed, that you're trying to recreate what Andrew lost." "Regina says many things." Arthur took a step toward her. "Yes, I looked for similarities. I looked for girls with musical talent, with a certain appearance, a certain background. I was trying to fill a void, to compensate for a guilt. It was wrong, it was sick, I know." The raw honesty of his confession partially disarmed Helen. "And with me, is it different?" "Completely." Arthur took another step, now close enough to touch, but he kept his hands firmly at his sides. "With you for the first time since Andrew died, I'm not looking at the past. I'm seeing a future I never imagined was possible for someone like me." Helen felt her heart race. There was something devastatingly vulnerable in the way Arthur was exposing himself, laying his pride at her feet. "I lied for you," she admitted. "About your confession, I said you never mentioned anything about poisoning your father." Arthur's eyes widened in surprise. "Why?" "I'm not sure." Helen looked away, confused about her own motives. "Maybe because, despite everything, I believe you're trying to change, that you deserve a chance at redemption. Or maybe," Arthur said softly, "because what's growing between us is too strong to be denied." He raised his hand slowly, giving Helen time to pull back if she wished. When she didn't move, he touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted with everything she had ever seen in him. "I chose to stay," Helen said, holding his gaze. "But on conditions. What are they? First, I want real freedom. The ability to leave the mansion when I want, to visit my family, to have a life beyond these walls." Arthur nodded. "Fair. Second, I want to know the truth about Elena. Everything. I want to visit her grave, meet her family if possible. If I'm going to be part of this story, I need to know all of it." A flash of pain crossed Arthur's face, but he nodded again. "And third," Helen hesitated, searching for the right words, "I want you to get help, therapy. What you did to your father, as much as he may have deserved it, it's not something that can stay buried forever. It will consume you from the inside, as it's already doing. This condition seemed the hardest for Arthur to accept. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture Helen now recognized. "Are you asking me to confess? To turn myself in?" "I'm asking you to start healing," Helen corrected. "How you do that is up to you. But I can't build something with someone whose demons will eventually destroy him." For a long moment, Arthur remained silent, the conflict evident on his face. Finally, he returned to her side. "I accept your conditions," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "All of them. For you. For us." Helen felt the last of her internal walls crumble. He was truly willing to change, to face his darkest ghosts, to risk everything for what could be between them. When Arthur pulled her to him this time, the kiss was different. No longer charged with desperation or urgency, but with a promise, a commitment. His hands slid down Helen's back, pressing her against his body as if he feared she might disappear. And she responded with equal intensity, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body molding to his as if they were made for this moment. "Come with me," Arthur whispered when they broke apart. Breathless, he led her through the mansion upstairs, down corridors Helen had never explored before. Finally, they stopped before a set of dark wooden double doors. Arthur hesitated, his hand on the knob. "This is my bedroom," he said. "None of the others have ever been in here. This is my sanctuary, my most private space." Helen understood the meaning of the gesture. Arthur wasn't just inviting her into his room. He was allowing her into a part of his life he had kept closed off to everyone. The room was surprising in its simplicity. Large, yes, with a king-size bed, dark wood furniture, and an entire wall of windows overlooking the forest. But it lacked the ostentatious luxury Helen might have expected. It was a masculine, functional space, with a few personal touches, books stacked on the nightstand, a framed photograph of Arthur and Andrew as children, an antique violin hanging on the wall. "It was Andrew's," Arthur said, noticing her gaze on the instrument. He played several instruments, but the piano was his passion. Helen walked over to the photograph, studying the two smiling boys, a teenage Arthur, already with a serious demeanor, but with a smile she rarely saw, and a younger Andrew, with bright eyes and a mischievous expression. "You look happy." "We were," Arthur replied, stopping behind her. "Before our father decided I should be the responsible heir and Andrew the sensitive artist. Before he molded us into versions of what he wanted us to be." Helen turned, finding him very close. The intimacy of the moment, of being in his room surrounded by his most personal memories, created an almost palpable tension between them. "And now?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Who do you want to be now?" "Someone worthy of you," Arthur answered, his voice low and intense. "Someone who can love without destroying, build without controlling." The word love hung between them, laden with meaning. Helen felt her heart pound. It was too soon, too fast to speak of love. And yet, what she felt for Arthur went beyond physical attraction, beyond curiosity or compassion. It was something deep and frightening in its intensity. When he kissed her again, there was no more hesitation, only certainty. Helen's hands found the buttons of his shirt, undoing them with fingers trembling in anticipation. Arthur lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed, laying her down with a gentleness that contrasted with the urgency of his kisses. What followed was a mutual discovery, a mapping of bodies and reactions, an intimate dance that transcended the physical. Helen, who had never fully given herself to anyone before, found in Arthur an attentive and patient partner, guiding her through new sensations without ever rushing or pressuring her. And when they finally came together, their bodies entwined, their breaths synchronized, Helen felt as if she had found a home she never knew she was looking for, not in the Montgomery estate, but in Arthur's arms, in the heart of this complex, damaged man who, against all odds, had found in her a chance for redemption. Afterward, lying in the dim light of the room, the rain pattering softly against the windows, Arthur traced lazy patterns on the bare skin of Helen's back. "What happens now?" she asked, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "Whatever you want to happen," Arthur replied, kissing the top of her head. "We can stay here at the estate, or we can go somewhere else, start over where no one knows our story. And the Montgomery Corporation? Your work? I can manage it from anywhere. I have competent teams." He paused, thoughtful. In fact, for the past few years, I've been more absent than present. Since Andrew's death, I've buried myself in work only as a form of escape. And me? Helen asked, propping herself up to look him in the eye. What would I be in this new life? A kept mistress? A trophy wife? Arthur held her face in his hands. You would be whatever you choose to be. If you want to study, I will give you every opportunity. If you want to work, I will support you. If you want to play professionally, I will open every door. His eyes shone with an intensity Helen had never seen before. The only thing I ask is that you allow me to be by your side, whatever path you choose. The weight of that declaration, of the freedom he was offering, brought tears to Helen's eyes. It was more than she had ever hoped for when she first walked through the gates of the Montgomery estate. I want music, she said finally. I want to study seriously, to develop my talent. And I want my family nearby safe. Consider it done. But I also want you, Helen continued, touching his face. This you, the man I see now, not the mask you wear for the world. I want you to keep opening up, to keep healing. Arthur nodded, a naked vulnerability in his gaze. It will be a long journey, he warned. I have decades of walls to tear down. We have time, Helen replied, sealing the promise with a kiss. 6 months later, the transformation in Helen's life was almost complete. Her family had been moved from Hollow Ridge to a comfortable house on the outskirts of New York City. Her father's debt had not only been forgiven, but replaced with a respectable job in one of the Montgomery Group's companies, adapted to his physical limitations. Tanya, her sister, now attended one of the best schools in the city, with plans to study medicine. Helen divided her time between the conservatory, where she formerly studied piano, and the Montgomery estate, which had slowly ceased to be a gilded cage and had become a home. Arthur, true to his promise, was getting help. Weekly sessions with a discreet therapist who came to the mansion, and occasionally, when the weight of the past became unbearable, long late-night conversations with Helen, where he exposed his deepest wounds without fear or reservation. The mansion itself had also changed. Arthur had the written rules removed, opened all the previously forbidden rooms, and transformed the music room into a bright, accessible space where he and Helen often played together. It was during one of these musical afternoons that Arthur paused in the middle of a duet and looked at Helen with a serious expression. There's something we need to do, he said. Something I've been putting off for a long time. The next day they drove to a small cemetery just outside the city. Helen held Arthur's hand tightly as they walked among the headstones until they reached a simple grave. Elena Rodriguez, the stone read. 1996-2021. The music does not end. It just changes rooms. Arthur knelt before the headstone, placing a bouquet of white flowers on it. I should have come sooner, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have faced this a long time ago. Helen remained silent, giving him the space he needed for this moment of closure. She deserved more, Arthur continued, speaking as much to Helen as to the grave. She deserved to live, to love, to create music. Andrew deserved the same, and for years I carried the weight of not having stopped what happened. He stood up, discreetly wiping away a tear. But now I understand that I can't change the past. I can only honor it by living fully in the present. Arthur turned to Helen, taking her hands in his. And that's what I want to do with you. Right there, in front of Elena's grave, Arthur asked Helen to marry him, not with an ostentatious ring or grandiose words, but with a simple, true promise. I want to build something new with you, something that is only ours, without ghosts, without a past. The wedding took place 3 months later, an intimate ceremony in the gardens of the Montgomery estate. Helen's family, a few close friends, colleagues from the conservatory. No sign of Regina, who, after her failed attempt to incriminate Arthur, had retreated to Europe with a generous monthly pension, the price of her silence. During the reception, as the guests danced under the soft lights hanging from the trees, Arthur led Helen to the piano in the main hall. I have a gift for you, he said, pulling a folded piece of sheet music from his pocket. Helen carefully unfolded the paper and read the title. Rebirth in B major, for Helen, who taught me how to live again. You composed this? She asked, surprised. Over the past few weeks, in secret. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that now appeared frequently on his face. Andrew wasn't the only one with musical talent in the family. I just never had the courage to explore that side of myself. Until now. Together they sat at the piano, their fingers finding the keys in perfect harmony. The music they created that night was not about grief or obsession, not about guilt or redemption. It was about possibilities, about beginnings, about a love born in the shadows but now blooming fully in the light. And as they played, the guests gradually gathered around the piano, watching in awe the couple who seemed to communicate without words, only through the notes that danced between them like promises. Helen looked at Arthur and saw not the cold, controlling man who had received her at the mansion gates months before, but a partner, a lover, a man in the process of healing. And she knew